Hi, and welcome back to Programming with Pax. In today's video, we're going to do a deep dive on CSS Grid. We'll start by talking about what it is and the problems that it solves, and then we're going to look at all of the different fundamental grid concepts that you need to know. After that, we're going to look at a simple grid project, and I'm going to explain my thought process on how I would approach it and how I would build it. And then we're going to build it together. I'm super excited, so let's get started. All right, so Grid allows you to not only create layouts which are one dimension or one direction, but two dimension, meaning that you can have some areas be longer rows while other areas be longer columns and everything in between. Because of this, you can make really complex layouts which would be really difficult otherwise. Now, just like with Flexbox, you'll need a container that goes around everything. Inside of the container, we have grid items, and these are the sections of your layout, which in this case are all of these boxes. Another important concept of grid are called grid tracks, which are lines between all of the rows and columns. So for the rows, it actually starts up at the top here, and then it'll go between each one of these. Now, at the very top, this starts as track 1, track 2, track 3, and track 4 for your rows. Similarly, for columns, you have your 1 starting here, your 2, your 3, and your 4. Finally, between the grid items are these gaps. These are called grid gaps, and you can make them bigger or smaller, or you don't have to have them at all, but they exist. All right, so here's an example project. In the HTML, I have a grid container here and 5 grid items inside. For the CSS, all I'm doing is resetting the margin. I'm increasing the font size to 40 pixels just to make things a bit easier for you to read. The grid container currently has nothing inside, and the grid items just simply have a color and a little bit of margin around it. Now, the first thing we're going to do is add display grid inside of the container. And when I save, you can see that pretty much nothing happens. And that's because grid by default will not really do anything. You'll need to define the columns and the rows first. So let's start by looking at the columns. We can do this by adding grid template columns, and I'm going to set it to 300 pixels. And when I save, we can see that we have one column and it is 300 pixels wide. Now, if I add another number after this will actually describe the second column. So if I save, we can see that we have a 300 pixel column and a 100 pixel column. I could continue and do a 500 pixel, and when I save, this creates a third column. I'm going to revert back to 2 columns and save. Now, something unique to grid is the concept of FR, or fractions. So if I add FR here at the end to both of them, and save, we can see that the first column is going to be 3 times the width of the second column. And just like before, we could create additional columns just by adding on to this list. So if I save here, we can now see that the first column is 3 fractions, the second is 1, and then 2 fractions, and finally 0.5 fractions. So this fourth item is half the size of item 2. Now I'm going to go back to the 3FR, 1FR and save. Now if I wanted this to repeat, so a third column of 3FR and a fourth column of 1FR and save, this would work, but there's actually a simpler way of doing it. And that is with the repeat keyword. So if I wrap it in a repeat and specify how many times I want it to repeat, so the first number right here is how many times you want it to repeat, and then after the comma is what you want to repeat. And so if I save now, we can see that we get the same results. I'm going to move the browser over just a little bit just to give a bit more room for the code. So if I wanted 4 different columns and I wanted them to all be the same size in width, how do you think I could accomplish this? Pause the video if you want and just think about it for a second. So the way you can accomplish this is by having 4 columns, and they would all be the same width. So that means that they would all be 1FR. And if I save here, you can see we have 4 columns all of the same width. And that's responsive as well, of course. So it'll grow and shrink accordingly. You can see that this fifth item goes to the next row, and that's because there just isn't enough room in these 4 columns. Now, one more thing I want to show you is auto fit and a width. If I save now, what it's going to do is try to automatically fit in as many 200 pixel columns as possible. So where before we had 4 different columns, now we can have as many as can fit in. And we can change this width to whatever we want, like 400 pixels. And when we save, we can see that the browser is trying to fit in as many of these 400 width columns as possible. So right now, there's not enough room right here, but if I increase the browser size, right there, it's going to fit in another one. So this is repeat with autofit. Super handy. Now the browser on the left is actually Firefox. And one of the reasons I love Firefox so much is that it's really great for CSS Grid. So if I right click and go to Inspect Element, you can see here that it detects the grid. So if I enable this, you can now see that there are pink lines everywhere. And you can use these as a ruler and a guide for while you're building your layout. So I'm going to keep this at the bottom here for the rest of the video, and we can see how much it helps. Next, let's look at rows. So just like with columns, we're going to define them with grid template rows. So if I set it to 300 pixels and save, you can now see that we have defined one row, which will be 300 pixels in height. Now, just like with columns, we can define a second row by putting 300 pixels here. And here's Firefox being amazing and showing us what our grid layout looks like. So just like before, we can use the repeat keyword. And let's make 4 rows of 200 pixels each. And when I save, you can now see we have 4 different rows, and all of them are 200 pixels in height. And of course, if I shrink the browser and bring it in, it will adjust accordingly. Now, another really cool tool is Grid Auto Rows. Now, I'll set this to 400, and I'm going to change the repeat to 2. And when I save, you can see that we now have 2 defined rows. Now, what this auto rows is basically saying is if there is a row which doesn't have a defined height, then use 400 pixels instead. So if I bring the browser down, we can see that we now have 2 rows. If I keep going, now there are 3 rows, and this third row is 400 pixels in height. So these first 2 rows have a 200 pixel height, and anything beyond that is going to have this fallback default value. All right, so I've changed it back to 4 rows and commented out the auto rows. Something else I really want to show you is what's called min-max. So in the HTML, if I had a whole bunch of lorem ipsum in here, or text or content, whatever, and I save, you can see that the content goes way beyond the 200 height row. Now, a way we can get around this is again by using the auto rows, but instead this time using min-max. And what this takes is a minimum value, so let's say 200 pixels, and a maximum value that you want the row height to be. So let's say auto, and I'm going to comment out the template rows above it. And when I save, you can see now that the row is taking up the entire height of the content. And what's really cool is if I make this smaller and smaller, and so that there's 2 rows, you can see that the minimum row height is 200 pixels, and any row that has content that goes beyond 200 pixels will just take up whatever space it needs. So another super useful tool to know about. All right, so we're back to 4 rows of 200 pixels each. Now, something else we can do is add a grid column gap, and let's say 10 pixels here, and when I save, you can see that the column gaps are now 10 pixels. And if I want to add a gap between the rows, it's going to be grid row gap. And let's do 30 pixels. And if I save here, you can see that there is a gap of 30 pixels. So if I resize the browser to make 2 rows, you can see that there is a 30 pixel gap. And if I wanted a gap to apply to both row and column, I could say grid gap. And let's say 20 pixels. And comment out these 2 lines. And when I save, there we go, 20 pixel gap. Now, just like with Flexbox, we have access to justify items. which will affect the grid container's children. So let's say center here, and if I save, you can see that the content is going to be centered within the grid area. We have access to center, we have start, and also end, and also there's align items for the other axis. So same thing. So let's try end. And we can see that each grid child's content goes to the bottom right. All right, now that we know the basics of rows and columns, we're going to switch things up and try to make this real-world layout. So if you think of a website, you'll often have a nav bar that goes across the whole top, and then perhaps you'll have a sidebar with different articles, a main section which talks about the company, and then perhaps different products, and of course a footer. So I want to walk through with you on how I would approach to make this design. Now the first thing I would do is count how many rows and columns there are. So we can see that there's one row here, another here, one here, and finally another row here. And then for columns, we can see that there's one column here, one here, one here, and also one here. So we know we are looking at a 4-row, 4-column layout. Now when it comes to the columns, they look like they're all equal size. So we know that we can use a repeat for auto on that. And for the rows, if we call this nav element 1 fraction or 1 FR, then we can see that the footer element is roughly 2 times the size of the nav. So we'll know that it's 2 FR. And now that we have that established, we can see that this third row right here is probably going to be 3 FR. And finally, this second row is going to probably be 4 FR. Now, when it comes to the HTML, I'll simply make HTML elements for each of the sections. So we can see that there are 7 separate sections. And so I've gone ahead and made 7 sections here. And in the CSS, all I've done is added the background color to them. All right, let's get started. So let's switch over to the other tab. And this is what we're currently starting with. Now we know that the layout is going to take up the entire screen. So let's add a height of 100 VH and a width of 100 VW. And let's save, and there we go. Now the next thing we know is that there were 4 equal columns. So let's add a grid template column, or GTC if you're using Emmet extension. And let's do a repeat of 4 and auto. And when I save, now you can see we have 4 equal columns. Now if we go back and look at the rows, we said that the first row is going to be 1 FR. So let's do grid template rows. And we know that it's going to be 1 FR for the first row. And then we said that this second row would be 4 FR. The third row looks like 3 FR. And the last one will be 2 FR. Now let's go back to our other tab. And when I save, we can see that we're getting somewhere. So this top row is 1 FR, then you've got 4, 3, and 2. Another thing we can see is that there is a small gap here. So we know that there's going to be a grid gap of 16 pixels. And let's turn the grid back on. I don't know why it does that sometimes. When I save, it turns off the grid overlay. Perfect. So we can see now that we're getting closer to the design. Now what we need to learn to do is to stretch this nav element all the way across the top. And the way that we can do that is that on each of the elements themselves, we will define where it starts and where it ends. So we can do grid column start, and we know that it's going to start at the very start, so 1, and where we want it to end, so grid column end, GCE, we want it to end at the 5th track. So again, we have 1, this is 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we want it to end at 5. And when we save, we've got a nav bar that takes up the whole width. Now, another cool thing about Firefox when it comes to grid is that we can actually turn on the numbers for all the tracks. So we can see the tracks are numbered 1 all the way to 5 for rows, and for columns, 1 all the way to 5. So let's do the start and end for the nav bar now. So similarly to column, it's going to be grid row start, or GRS, and we want that to start at 1, and the grid row end, GRE, is going to end at 2. 1 to 2. And if we save, well, nothing happens, because by default it was already taking up the full row. But that's the syntax. Now let's look at what this main element should be. So if I go back over, we can see that the main starts at column track 1 and then ends at 3. And that's because of 1 being here, 2 being here, and 3 being here. So let's write grid column start, and let's say 1, and grid column end at 3. And for the rows, we can see that it starts at 2 and ends at 3. So let's do grid row starts at 2 and grid row ends at 3. I'm not going to save yet, but if I go over to the other tab and now let's save, we can see that the main element takes up that space. Now I want to show you another couple ways of writing these. So another way of defining the column would be GC, which gives grid column, and I can say I want it to start at 1 and end at 3. And if I comment this out and save, we can see that it stays the same. And similarly, we can do GR for grid row, and we know that we want it to start at 2 and end at 3. And if I comment this out and save, of course, it stays the same. We can actually push this even further, and we can use grid area, and this takes the row start, followed by the column start, and then the row end, and then the column end. And if I comment this out and save, you can see that everything works the same. Personally, I find this syntax to be really confusing because you have to remember that it's row start, then column start, then row end, then column end, but I just wanted to show you that it at least exists. All right, so let's style the footer, and then I'm going to show you something really cool. So we know that the footer goes from the first column until the 4th column, and the row goes from the 4th row until the 5th row. So that is grid column, and we'll do 1 until 4. And for grid row, we know that it's going to be 4 until 5. I'm not going to save yet. Let's go back over. Now let's save, and we can see that that's exactly what's happening. Okay, so you can see where I'm going with all this, and you can continue to write it in this way, and of course finish up the styling to look like this layout. Of course, it's very doable, but I want to show you another way of writing it. All right, so let's go ahead and delete all of these columns and rows. So I'm just going to go forward and delete everything. And when I save, of course, we're back to where we originally were. Now in each of the elements, if we add grid area and then give it a name, so for nav, let's say nav. For main, let's say main. Content 1, content 2, content 3. Let's call this the aside. And finally, the footer. If we save, we can see that things aren't quite looking right. So if we scroll back up to the container, what we can add now is grid template areas. And in here, we can add quotes, and we can simply use the names that we assigned before. So if I say nav, 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 and save, we can now see that the nav element takes up 4 columns for each of the 4 navs that we wrote. And the reason that there are 6 columns now is because these other elements haven't yet been assigned, and so the browser is kind of freaking out and it puts it at the bottom right just to let you know that these are unassigned. So let's keep going, and then when we get to the end, it'll go back to 4 columns. Now I like to have it on its own separate line, and on the next row, if we go back to the layout, we have main, content 3, and sidebar. And we called the sidebar aside. So that's going to be main, content 3, and aside. On the next row, we have content 1, content 2, content 3, and aside. And finally, we have footer, and aside. So just to make sure you understand, these 3 footers are here because the footer in our layout is going to take up 3 different columns here. And then the 4th column is the aside, or the sidebar. So each of these represents a row. Now I haven't saved, so let's go back to the other tab. and save, and boom, there's the completed layout. So if I close this and go back and forth, you can see that the layouts are the exact same. So personally, I love writing my grid layouts using this syntax. I find it really easy and intuitive to write. And that is a wrap. Whew, that was a longer video. That was good. If you have any questions at all, let me know in the comment section down below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. If you did enjoy this video, then consider dropping a like, as it really helps this channel out. And subscribe for more content just like this. On that note, thank you very much for your time. I hope you're having a great day, and I will see you in the next one.